The racist murderer has been living with George and his partner Nicola Mitchell, Laura Doddington, since getting early release from prison after being diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. George was previously estranged from his adopted father after it was revealed Eddie killed George's birth father in a racially motivated attack when the former Queen Vic landlord was still a child. That also came after George found out that Eddie and his wife Gloria, Elizabeth Council, adopted him through an illegal process called baby farming back in the 1950s. Upon his reappearance on the BBC soap earlier this month, Eddie made it clear he was determined to spend his final days with his son, bribing Nicola into making his living arrangement happen in exchange for cash to save her flailing businesses. Next week, George realizes he needs to do more to protect his family after Eddie's true colors resurface. Gina Knight, Francesca Henry, learns from her boyfriend Harry Mitchell, Elijah Holloway, that Eddie has made disgusting remarks about her again, and later confronts George about the situation. George pales upon learning that Eddie has not changed, and attempts to apologize to Gina, but she flees. Knowing he needs to step up for his daughter, George then tells Eddie he's sending him back to prison to see out his final days. But Eddie then drops the bombshell about Nicola allowing him to stay with them in return for money, leaving George dumbfounded. As the pair argue, old emotions bubble to the surface, and George finally renounces Eddie as his dad for his actions and treatment of his family. He then makes a last-minute decision to protect himself and his family from his dad's actions for good. However, soap bosses have teased that George may live to regret what he ends up doing, with next week's special episode set to change everything for several key characters, George being one of them. Could it be that he impulsively kills Eddie? George Knight had always believed he could handle anything life in Walford threw at him. He'd survived chaos, secrets, heartbreak, and the relentless pressure of family ties that never quite stayed buried. But Eddie's return was something else entirely. A shadow he thought he'd long escaped suddenly walking straight back into his world, uninvited and unrepentant. From the moment Eddie reappeared, George felt it in his bones. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat. Eddie didn't even need to speak loudly to dominate a room. There was a cold confidence in the way he moved through the square, like he still owned invisible territory that everyone else had forgotten existed. To most people, he was just another returning face. To George, he was history clawing its way back into the present. Dirty, unresolved, and dangerous. At first, George tried restraint. He told himself he was stronger now. That he was a father, a businessman, a man rebuilding his life in the world of EastEnders. He even convinced himself that Eddie's presence was temporary, like a storm cloud that would pass if ignored long enough. But Eddie didn't come to pass. He came to settle. It started with small provocations. Eddie lingering too long outside the Queen Vic, Eddie dropping comments wrapped in nostalgia but sharpened with intent. Eddie mentioning names from the past George had buried so deep they felt like scars instead of memories. Then came the escalation. One evening, George found Eddie talking to Gina and Anna outside the pub, laughing too loudly, too comfortably, as if he belonged there more than George did. The sight hit George like a punch to the ribs. Not because of jealousy, but because Eddie had always had a talent for twisting perception. He made himself look like the victim, the misunderstood one, while quietly dismantling everyone else's stability. That night, George didn't sleep. He sat alone in silence, replaying every interaction, every smirk, every loaded sentence Eddie had spoken. The conclusion came slowly, but once it formed, it refused to leave. Eddie wouldn't stop on his own, so George would have to stop him. The idea terrified him more than Eddie ever had, because George Knight was not a man who believed in crossing lines. But Eddie had always lived on the other side of them, and he knew exactly how to drag others across. The next morning, George moved differently, calm on the surface, controlled. But inside, something had hardened. Not rage exactly, something colder. Purpose. He began by observing Eddie's routines, his patterns, the way he always lingered near certain places at certain times. George listened more than he spoke, watching how Eddie interacted with others, how he tested boundaries like a man tapping glass to find cracks. And then George found the crack Eddie didn't think anyone had noticed. A quiet exchange. A name from the past that Eddie slipped out too casually, assuming no one in Walford was listening closely enough to connect it. But George was listening, and suddenly everything made sense. Eddie wasn't just stirring trouble for sport. He was protecting something or someone from being exposed. And whatever that secret was, it was the key to ending this once and for all. George didn't feel triumph. Not yet. Only resolve. That evening, he confronted Eddie behind the Prince Albert, where the noise of the square faded into a dull hum. The air between them felt heavier than usual, as if even the weather knew something irreversible was about to happen. Eddie smiled when he saw George. "That look on your face," Eddie said softly. "That's the same one your father used to get." George flinched just slightly. "But enough. You don't get to mention him," George replied. "Oh, I think I do," Eddie said, "considering everything he left behind." That was the moment something inside George snapped into focus. Not rage. Clarity. "I know what you're doing," George said quietly. "You're not here to reconnect. You're here to destabilize everything I've built." Eddie tilted his head. "Built? George, you didn't build this life. You escaped into it." The words landed too precisely, too deliberately. George stepped closer. "It ends now." For the first time, Eddie's smile faltered just a fraction. He understood then that George wasn't bluffing. But what Eddie didn't yet understand was how far George had already gone in his mind. Over the next 48 hours, George acted with precision. He didn't rush. He didn't lash out. He dismantled Eddie's influence piece by piece. Conversations were redirected. Alliances quietly shifted. Old debts were revisited. Questions were asked in the right ears at the right time. Eddie began to notice the change. People were pulling away. Doors weren't opening as easily. His confidence, once effortless, started to feel like it was echoing in an empty room. And George? George remained steady, almost gentle in public. A man with no visible agenda. That was what made him dangerous. Because Eddie had always relied on chaos. George was learning to rely on control. The final confrontation came without witnesses. Eddie met George near the edges of Walford, where the noise thinned and the streetlights flickered with unreliable patience. "You've been busy," Eddie said. "I've been decisive," George replied. A pause. Then Eddie laughed softly. "You think you've won something?" "I think I've ended it," George corrected. For a moment there was silence between them.